This is the story of a man during the silent generation who made sacrifices in order to fight for his country and keep his people safe. The silent generation consisted of people who lived during the Korean War. But first, let me show you who this man is by telling you a little bit about him. Richard Harris was born in 1929 in a borough of New York City, the Bronx. He lived close to his grandparents and was able to visit them very much throughout his childhood. While talking to him, he said, "One of my favorite memories was eating cereal and strawberries with my grandfather." When he turned 4 in 1933, he moved to Beverly Hills, where his dad worked for a movie studio, 20th Century Fox, which was next to Shirley Temple's producer. With his luck, he was then invited to Shirley Temple's birthday party. It was very exciting, since she was such a big star in Hollywood. Richard lived in Beverly Hills for 6 years, and then moved back to the Bronx, where he had his bar mitzvah in 1942. He graduated high school in 1947 and got a job in a garment center for 3 years. He had a very good and normal life until one thing changed. Richard Harris was drafted into the Army on November of 1950 as a combat engineer whose job was to work on military roads. Later on, he was sent to Camp Gordon, based in Augusta, Georgia. There, he went through basic training until the end of 1951. Then, he was sent overseas to South Korea in January of 1952. The Korean War started with a surprise attack. North Korea attacked South Korea on June 25, 1950. The United Nations Security Council called for a ceasefire. 2 days after the attack, the Security Council insisted the UN assist South Korea. In response to this request, 16 nations sent troops to aid South Korea. The U.S. contributed 400,000 men, which was a significant help. When President Harry S. Truman heard about the attack, he directed General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, who was commander of U.S. occupation forces in Japan, to ensure safe evacuation of U.S. civilians and to supply weapons and ammunition. On June 26th, air and naval forces were directed to help. The closest forces were stationed in Japan. These troops consisted of inexperienced, undertrained men lacking in heavy weapons, since they were not a combat unit but an occupying force. South Korean forces were then put under UN command and control. In late July, they were pressed into a small area around the port of Busan at the southeastern tip. The UN forces were then, finally, able to help reinforce and started to pour in. For centuries, the three powerful neighbors of Korea, China, Japan, and the Soviet Union, all wanted to have control. In 1910, Japan established rule until the surrender that ended World War II. Before they established this, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The Soviet troops entered Korea and then accepted the surrender of the Japanese north of 38th parallel of latitude. The United States also accepted the units south of this. The Soviet Union quickly sealed off its border, and the government was made by communist officials. The US maintained their government in the South. In 1948, the UN voted for free elections throughout Korea to choose a single government. The Soviet Union refused the United Nations elections to enter the North. This caused the Republic of Korea to form, which was a democracy in the South. The North also created the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which was a communist dictatorship. In 1948, the Soviet Union left the North, and in 1949, the US left the South. Both places were able to maintain how they were when they had their allies' help. In 1950, the North decided to fight for communist rule, but the attacks didn't work. North Korea met disaster on land, in the air, and at sea. They wanted to make the 38th parallel line a border between the two parts. South Korea and the US decided then to take over North Korea, but got too close to China. China started to fight back, and in the end, the South decided to accept the separation between the North and the South. Unfortunately, the fighting still went on for still some bit of time. Peace was then discussed and fighting slowed down. In mid-October, the Communists lost and wanted to reopen truce talks. This was discussed for another year and a half, until July 27, 1953, a peace treaty was signed, and at 10 p.m. Korean time, all guns fell silent. The Korean War was a hard time to be in, and it was certainly hard for my grandpa. Not only was it hard to deal with the cold weather in the winter, and the weather in the spring making your clothing wet, but it was hard to deal with what was going on around him. My grandpa did not like being in the army. It was a big change for him, coming from such a normal life. People were fighting and killing each other all around him. All he wanted to do was focus on the things he had to. He wanted to focus on making roads so truck traffic could keep moving. He also did not know many people. Nobody from back home came that he knew. Nobody during the war became a close friend. However, he was able to join the softball team while he was in Korea. My grandfather did not have the best time of his life. He said the army was a hard adjustment for anybody coming from civilian life. It's hard to think about living in such a horrible time. I can't imagine how happy my grandpa was when he was able to leave. In 1952, Richard was released from the army. He went back to the Bronx to his wife, my grandmother, Anita. They had my Uncle Stephen in 1953, and then my father in 1957. They bought a house in New Jersey where my grandpa started his own business called DMC Sale Corporation. His business consisted of selling denim fabric to jean makers and buying textiles to resell to manufacturers. He worked for 20 years before retiring and moved to Florida. My dad, Ed, met my mom, Ann, in Israel and got married on July 4th, 1978. They adopted their first child, Gabriella, from Peru in March of 1990 and moved here in September. Then they had their second child, Sam, in 1993 and moved to Bellevue when they adopted their last child, me, from Guatemala. Now, I live in our 14-year-old house with my parents, while my sister is married, living in Seattle with her husband Andrew, and my brother is in college at Santa Cruz, California. My grandparents live in Florida and visit us during times that are not so cold, which is hard living where we do. They have made it possible for such a good family to be here, and I love them for that. Thank you, Grandpa, for all you have done and all the sacrifices you have made.